This is Wake Up Sunday Morning, brought to you from Celebration Church in Barrie. We are an Anglican network in Canada congregation. Good morning, I'm Derek Welsman here along with Pastor Brian McVitie. Delighted to be part of your Sunday morning. Toast, coffee, eggs, and Wake Up Sunday Morning, a great breakfast combination.
Last week, we mentioned that our intrepid reporter from Wake Up Sunday Morning was in Washington, D.C. Would we have a special interview with President Donald Trump? Would there be a special announcement from the White House carried exclusively on Wake Up Sunday Morning? Well, the short answer is no. However, Derek and his family were in Washington for the March break. We have asked him to share a few highlights with us now.
Certainly. All right. Well, our family was lucky enough to go on a personalized walking tour of the U.S. Capitol building, which was fascinating. The boys enjoyed seeing the Space Shuttle Discovery up close and personal at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. But the surprise hit of our trip was the brand new Museum of the Bible. We talked about it on an earlier episode. It is one of the best museums of the anything that we have ever been to. Great high-tech and interactive exhibits and creative storytelling about the Bible itself and the stories within the Bible. If you're going to Washington, D.C., go to the Museum of the Bible. And when you get there, tell them Derek sent you, and they'll probably look at you funny. But go. Today we are continuing our series on how we got the Bible. So far we have focused on the first 5 books of the Bible and examined the likely means whereby the material could have come down to Moses. Last week we jumped ahead and looked at the 4 Gospels, and today we jump back to the Old Testament and look at how the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures were pulled together. We come today to an obscure person by the name of Ezra. He has a small part in the Bible, but the evidence indicates he has a huge role in the creation of the Bible. Here is Pastor Brian McVitie with today's message on how we got the Bible, and today's focus, what was Ezra's role?
There are many miracles that are recounted for us in the Bible, and you're probably familiar with many of them. There's the parting of the Red Sea. There's the manna from heaven. There's the healing of the lame. And most important of all, there is the raising of Jesus from the dead. All of these miracles are contained within the Bible. But a miracle that we totally ignore is the fact that we even have a Bible. The fact that we have a Bible is a remarkable story, and it's well worth telling. Well, today we're continuing our series called How Did We Get the Bible? Well, let me just recap where we have come so far. So we began by placing the Bible on the timeline of ancient literature. And while it's not the most ancient of all literature, nevertheless, we looked at it in terms of all the literature that has existed from the beginning of time. And we noted that the Bible is unique in some significant ways. It is written by 40 different people on 3 different continents, in 3 different languages, and by people from all walks of life, and it has a unified message. There is nothing in all of human literature to compare with the Bible. Secondly, we looked at Moses. What did Moses write? Traditionally, he's been assigned as the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Torah, and we looked specifically at Genesis because that's where most of the controversy exists. We looked at the possible sources that Moses may have had for the composition of Genesis. We looked at Genesis and saw that it is primarily made up of a series of family histories, and we saw how they could have easily come down to Moses and how he stitched those together through the inspiration of God, which has come to us as the book of Genesis. Then our third week in this series, Diane preached on the topic, Meet the Ancestors. And she showed us how the earliest people outlined in the book of Genesis, who lived for 700 or 800 years, as you lay those out in a chart, you can see how their lifespan overlaps by decades or even hundreds of years. And how with this before us, we can see it would be very easy for these family stories to have been retained, passed on to subsequent generations. In this list of the ancestors, we saw how Seth may have been a key figure. Seth is the son of Noah. He lives before the flood, he lives after the flood, and in fact, he lives down to Abraham. And so this overlap of the generations make it very easy for these early records to have been passed on from generation to generation, and then down to Moses, and then written down into what we have today as the Torah. Well, today we want to pick up the story and look at the next steps in how did we get the Bible. Now, we don't know exactly who wrote the next several books of the Bible, but we do have clear indication that the Hebrews were writing down their stories and their history and what God was doing and revealing to them. Let me just give you a few quick references to show us that the Hebrews were deliberately keeping a written record. We have the end of Joshua, Joshua 24, verse 25. We're told Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. So not only did Joshua reverence and revered the works of Moses, and we're told that several times in the book of Joshua, but then that Joshua wrote as well and added these into the book of the law of God. He continued the story, perhaps what we have today as the book of Joshua. Then we read in 1 Samuel 10:25 that Samuel wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. So Samuel, influential, choosing David to be king, used mightily by God, we're told that he wrote all of this down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. Possibly what we have in 1 and 2 Samuel. Then let's look at 2 Chronicles 20:24. Talks about from the beginning to the end, these are written in the annals. And so again, we have a reference that through the court documents, through the kings and their courts, these things are documented and written down. All of which is to prove that the Hebrews were diligent in keeping records, and these have formed the basis for the scriptures that we have today. Now let's just look at a timeline so that we have clear in our minds the dates and the sequence continuing on from Moses. So I've rounded out these dates just to keep this easy for us to keep in our minds or focus. So about 1500 BC we have Moses. Then about 1000 BC, we have King David, the author of the Psalms. Then 700 BC, we have the prophet Isaiah. 600 BC, we have the prophet Jeremiah. This brings us down to 550 BC, and we have Daniel, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the Babylonian captivity. Then after Daniel, we have Ezra, and we date Ezra about 450 BC. Ezra is initially in captivity, and then the ruler sends him back to Jerusalem with some of the other exiles who were returning, who were rebuilding Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple. But Ezra has the special assignment to teach the people the ways of Moses. Ezra, we're told, is both a scribe and a priest. So he is sent from exile back to Jerusalem to read and teach the Torah to the exiles as they returned. Ezra, we think, is a key figure, even though the book of Ezra, and we learn a little more about him in the book of Nehemiah, even those are short books, and maybe do not figure very large in our own reading of the scriptures, tradition, and we think that Ezra had a key role to play in compiling and pulling together all of the books of Moses, the history of the kings, and the prophets together into what we call the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament. That he is the one who pulled this all together. Now, not only was he devoted to the Scriptures and taught the Scriptures, as we're told in the books of both Nehemiah and Ezra, but we think because the temple was in the process of being built, that perhaps this was further impetus for Ezra to pull together the Scriptures, to formulate them, and to make sure then that they would be deposited within the new second temple when it was built. That was the repository for the Scriptures and would have been a key motivation for Ezra in making sure that these were all pulled together, retained, organized, and deposited into the new temple. So Ezra, we think about 450 BC, pulled together most of what we have in the Old Testament.
You're listening to Wake Up Sunday Morning from Celebration Church. That was Pastor Brian McVitie bringing us the first part of today's message on how we got the Bible. We are just 3 weeks away from Easter. To prepare our hearts for this great celebration of Jesus' victory, today's song is At the Cross by Brian Dirksen.
I know a place, a wonderful place, where accused and condemned find mercy and grace, where the wrongs we have done and the wrongs done to us were nailed there with him, there on the cross. At the cross, he died for our sin. At the cross, he gave us life again. I know a place, a wonderful place, where accused and condemned find mercy and grace, where the wrongs we have done and the wrongs done to us were nailed there with him, there on the cross. At the cross, you died for our sin. At the cross, you gave us life again. I know a place, a wonderful place.
Brian Dirksen, At the Cross. This coming Saturday, April 6th, Emmanuel Church Barrie will be hosting the Fearless Faith Conference. It will touch on some of the same topics as this series on how we got the Bible. This conference promises to be a wonderful local event to strengthen faith, deepen understanding, and equip us to share the gospel with grace and confidence. Learn about the reliability of the New Testament, how to equip our children to be strong in faith, and you can also learn more about Islam. This is being organized by Apologetics Canada, who have brought other great events to Barrie. Here's Pastor Brian with the second part of today's message on how we got the Bible and the role of Ezra and subsequent translators.
So next question, how do we know that what came down to Ezra and then what he passed on was accurately transmitted and copied? Now let's just remember that there were no photocopiers, there were no Xerox machines. All of these scrolls, books of the Bible, had to be painstakingly copied by hand. What assurance do we have that this was done faithfully and diligently over the centuries? That what we have in our hands today is accurate for what was originally written down? How was this transmitted? How was this done accurately? All of the evidence that we have shows how diligent this was done and the importance that the scribes assigned to this task. The scriptures were held in high honor, the inspired words of God Himself. The Hebrew scribes, Ezra was one of those, took great pains that this would be done accurately. And over the years, there was a clan of scribes called the Masoretes who took this on. And they took this task to a whole nother level. They knew how many words and how many letters were in each book of the Bible so that they could check themselves. They were so diligent in the copying of the scriptures that they would count words and letters. So we know from their own discipline and what we know about them that they were very hyper diligent in accurately copying the scriptures generation by generation. And let's just remember that these scrolls of the Bible were written on either tanned leather or on papyrus, which was an ancient type of paper made from reeds in Egypt, that these would wear out over the years, that they were reverently disposed of, and therefore this process of copying them had to be an ongoing and continual task. So, to the question as to how do we know that what we have is accurately transmitted, we have the information of the scribes, and particularly this clan called the Masoretes, and how diligent they were. Secondly, the other reason that we're so confident regarding the diligence and accuracy of these copies is a remarkable discovery that was made in 1946. And this is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So briefly, the story is the Dead Sea, this is in Israel. This is the same area where John the Baptist was preaching and teaching just before Jesus. Well, there are cliffs up from the Dead Sea, and burrowed into these cliffs, there are caves. And in 1946, there was a shepherd boy who had lost his sheep and was looking for it in these caves and discovered these clay urns that contained scrolls of the scriptures. And these are accurately dated back to the time of John the Baptist, and even earlier than John the Baptist, back to possibly 200 BC. So we can compare what has come down to us through the copies with what is discovered, and these scrolls dating back more than 1,000 years. So if there was going to be significant errors or problems in the copying of the scriptures, we could compare the oldest of what we had back to these Dead Sea Scrolls and discover that there are very few differences, some changes of spelling, but remarkably the same. Amongst the Dead Sea, there was a complete scroll of Isaiah, and there is almost no variation to what we have today in our Bibles. So remarkable. accuracy of copying the scriptures down through the ages. Next in this story of how we got the Bible, let's look then at the first major translation of the Bible. So we go back to about 200 BC, and this is the translation, the first major translation of the scriptures from Hebrew into Greek. And this is an interesting story as well. So King Ptolemy in Egypt, about 200 BC, he is third in line from Alexander the Greek, King Ptolemy. He was building a huge library in Alexandria in Egypt, and he wanted it to be the biggest and the best library in the world. And he wanted to have a copy of the Hebrew scriptures in Greek in his library in Alexandria. Now the legend says that he enlisted 70 Hebrew scholars and gave them 70 days to translate the Bible from Hebrew into Greek. Now the word, so this is 70 scholars, 70 days. The word for 7 in Greek is septa, and so this Greek translation is usually called the Septuagint, meaning 7 or 70, the Septuagint. Now this was a key step in the transmission of the Bible as to how we got the Bible today. And well, this is a fascinating story. So let me just mention 3 quick points. Number 1, first of all, a couple of difficulties. Taking the Hebrew scriptures, translating them into Greek, is not just translating them into another language, but there is a whole different thought process in the Hebrew mind and language compared to the Greek mind and language. Something is lost in the translation. Now, this is a whole topic that we're going to leave for another time, but I just wanted to mention that. Point number 2 about the Septuagint. For some reason that we don't know, they took it upon themselves in making this translation to change the order of the books. Now, a Hebrew Bible begins with Genesis and ends with Chronicles. The Hebrew Bible is laid out in 3 sections. The first section is the law, meaning the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. The second section of a Hebrew Bible is the prophets. And then the third section of the Hebrew Bible is the writings with Chronicles at the end of the writings. When the Greek translation was done, for some reason, they reordered the biblical books. They started with law, then history, then the writings, and then the prophets. Now it's interesting from the New Testament because Jesus knew the scriptures in the traditional Hebrew layout. In Luke 24, verse 44, Jesus refers to the scriptures as being the law, the prophets, and the writings, the traditional layout of the Hebrew scriptures. But for some reason, when the Bible was translated from Hebrew into Greek, they changed the order of the books, and this changed order is what we see in our Bibles today. The other issue with this Greek translation, called the Septuagint, is in doing it, putting it together, they added in additional books. There were books at that time that were regarded by the Jews as being inspirational, but never viewed as being scriptural. But somehow they were included in this Greek translation of the Bible. Most notable amongst these additional books are 1st and 2nd Maccabees. They are fascinating to read. I would commend them to you. They are inspirational, but they have never been considered as authoritative. So the result is that if you go into Chapters bookstore today and take Bibles off of the bookshelf and start comparing them, you will see that there are some differences. So Protestant Bibles, we know what a Protestant Bible looks like. It does not include Maccabees, but it does follow this reordering of the books according to the Septuagint. So this means that on your street, if you have a Jewish neighbor and you were to compare your Bible to their Bible, you would see that your Jewish neighbor has the same books in their scripture as you have in your Old Testament, except that the order of the books would be different. So that's the comparison with your Jewish neighbor. If you turn to your other neighbor, who is maybe Roman Catholic or Greek Orthodox, and compared Bibles, you would see that in the Old Testament, they have about 7 additional books in their Old Testament. This would include 1st and 2nd Maccabees. They would have certain additions to the book of Daniel. They would have other additions to the book of Esther, and so forth. So, this explains why today we have some differences in the Bibles depending on denomination. As Protestants or Anglicans or Lutherans, why do we not include these other books of the Bible? It had to do with the Reformers, Luther, Calvin, and the others, when they were translating the scriptures and endeavoring to get the most accurate rendering of the scriptures. They went back to the original Hebrew and they discovered that these additional books were never considered to be scripture, and so in the Protestant Bibles, these books have been removed, whereas the Roman Catholics included these books in their scriptures. So in conclusion, from the end of the Old Testament, about 400 BC, so the last of the Old Testament prophets is Malachi, and he's about 400 BC. From 400 BC, there are what is called the 400 silent years. No prophet, no inspired word from God from Malachi 400 BC until the angel Gabriel appears to Zechariah, or until John the Baptist begins preaching in the wilderness with a new word from the Lord himself. So if you're wondering why at the beginning of the New Testament, when Gabriel appears to Zechariah, when Gabriel appears to Mary, when John the Baptist starts preaching in the wilderness, why is there so much excitement and why is there so much buzz? Well, this is the first prophetic word from God in 400 years. Now, next week, we're going to take you into the world of espionage, smuggling, traitors, and murder. Next week, I will tell you about the blood that was shed so that we could have a Bible in English. A fascinating story of faith and heroes. Join us next week for our next installment of How We Got the Bible.
That was Pastor Brian McVitie wrapping up today's message on How We Got the Bible. You're listening to Wake Up Sunday Morning from Celebration Church in Barrie, and as we close today, we trust that you will be attending your own church. But if you are new to the area or you are searching for a Bible-based, Christ-centered place to worship, we want to invite you to join us at Celebration Church. Service time is every Sunday morning at 10:30, and we are located most conveniently at 460 Yonge Street in Barrie South End. We depend on you to support these radio broadcasts. Please consider donating to Wake Up Sunday Morning. To do so, please visit celebrationchurchbarrie.ca and click on the Donate button. Your donations are fully tax receivable and much appreciated to make possible these radio broadcasts. Wake Up Sunday Morning is available as a podcast. Subscribe now on both iTunes and Google Play, and take us wherever you go. You can also subscribe and stream on the Celebration Church YouTube channel. If God is blessing you through Wake Up Sunday Morning, please share the show with a friend. Be sure to join us next Sunday morning at 8 for Wake Up Sunday Morning. I'm Derek Welsman on behalf of Pastor Brian and everyone at Celebration Church Barrie. Have a blessed day.